Picture a textile mill in Massachusetts, 1903. The air thick with cotton dust and machine oil. Above your head, a leather belt moves at 30 miles per hour. It is 8 inches wide, a quarter inch thick. It looks like nothing. A woman named Catherine Murphy has worked beneath this belt for 6 years. She knows every sound it makes, every vibration. She has brushed against it 100 times. Today, a single strand of her hair touches the belt for less than 1 second. The belt grabs. Her head snaps sideways. 3 seconds later, she is dead. This is not a story about one belt. This is a story about the most dangerous piece of leather in history. The machine that was not a machine. The killer that lived in the ceiling of every factory in America. Before electricity conquered the factory, power moved through leather. In 1890, a typical textile mill contained 5 miles of leather belting. These belts connected hundreds of machines to a single massive steam engine in the basement. The engine turned a main shaft. The main shaft turned secondary shafts. The shafts turned pulleys. The pulleys drove the belts. The belts turned everything else. Looms, lathes, saws, grinders, pumps, fans. Every machine that made something, moved something, or cut something. The system was elegant. One engine could power an entire factory. The belts ran overhead, out of the way, silent except for a whisper of leather on iron. They seemed harmless. They were not. A leather belt moving at 30 miles per hour carries momentum you cannot see. It weighs perhaps 50 pounds for every 10 feet of length. When it is moving, that weight becomes force. When something catches on that belt, the belt does not slow down. The belt does not stop. The engine in the basement weighs 40 tons and produces 3,000 horsepower. A human body weighs perhaps 150 pounds. The belt does not notice. It simply pulls. Engineers in 1900 called this the entanglement problem. Workers called it getting taken by the belt. It happened in 3 ways: hair, clothing, hands. Hair was the worst. Women worked in textile mills because their fingers were considered more nimble for threading machines. They wore their hair long because short hair on women was considered improper. The mills required hair to be pinned up, but a 10-hour shift in heat and humidity guaranteed that strands came loose. 1 strand was enough. The belt grabbed. The scalp tore. If the woman was lucky, she was merely scalped. If she was unlucky, her neck broke when her head hit the machinery. In 1897, the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics recorded 43 deaths from belt entanglement in textile mills alone. 31 were women. 28 involved hair. Clothing was more common. A loose sleeve, a dangling apron string, the corner of a skirt. The belt caught fabric and wound it like thread on a spool. The person came with it. They were pulled into the machinery in seconds. Sometimes they were crushed between the belt and the pulley. Sometimes they were drawn into the gears of the machine the belt was powering. Sometimes they were simply beaten to death by the rotating shaft. The belt did not discriminate. In 1903, a machinist in Pittsburgh named Robert Chen reached up to adjust a belt that was slipping on its pulley. His shirt cuff touched the moving belt. He was pulled 20 feet across the shop floor and into the main drive shaft. He died before anyone could reach the engine room to shut down power. The belt kept running for another 6 minutes because the engineer on duty did not hear the shouting over the noise of the steam engine. Hands were the calculated risk. Workers constantly adjusted belts while they were running. Shifting a belt from one pulley to another changed the speed of a machine. It was part of the job. You used a wooden stick to push the belt sideways while it moved. Sometimes the stick slipped. Sometimes the belt was stiff and did not want to move. Sometimes you used your hand instead because it was faster. Sometimes your hand did not come back. The belt took fingers first, then the hand, then the arm. Factory doctors in the 1890s could identify belt injuries instantly. The arm was not severed. It was stripped. Skin, muscle, and bone, separated by rotational force. There was no clean amputation. There was no saving the limb. The horror of belt deaths was not the gore. The horror was that everyone knew it was going to happen, and nobody could stop it. The belts could not be guarded. They had to be accessible because they had to be adjusted constantly. They could not be slowed down because the machines they powered required specific speeds. They could not be stopped quickly because there was no emergency brake. The only way to stop a belt was to shut down the engine, and the engine took 15 minutes to power down safely. By then, the person was already dead. Factory owners knew this. Workers knew this. Insurance companies knew this. In 1901, factory insurance policies in New York State listed belt entanglement as an expected annual loss, the same way they listed fire and theft. The insurance tables calculated that a factory with 100 workers and 5 miles of belting would lose 1 worker every 18 months to belt accidents. This was considered normal. The economic logic was simple. Belts were cheap. Workers were cheaper. Stopping production to install guards cost money. Stopping production to investigate accidents cost money. Hiring a new worker cost nothing. There were always more workers. In 1905, the average factory wage was $12 per week. The average wrongful death settlement was $300. A factory could kill 25 workers per year and still spend less on settlements than they would spend on installing belt guards and losing production time during installation. The mathematics of industrial killing were efficient. Some workers tried to protect themselves. Women braided their hair tighter and used more pins. Men rolled their sleeves above the elbow and buttoned their cuffs. Some factories required workers to wear tight-fitting clothes with no loose fabric. This created its own problem. Tight clothes were hotter. In summer, mills regularly reached 110 degrees. Workers fainted from heat exhaustion and fell into the machinery. The belt took them anyway. Other factories tried installing warning bells that rang when a belt was slipping and needed adjustment. This failed because belts slipped constantly, and the bells rang so often that workers stopped paying attention to them. The sound became background noise, like the clatter of the looms or the hiss of steam pipes. When a belt actually failed, and the bell rang for a real emergency, nobody reacted. Belt failure was the other way the belts killed. Leather is organic. It stretches when wet. It cracks when dry. It weakens with age. A belt might run perfectly for 5 years and then simply split apart while running at full speed. When a belt broke, it did not fall gently to the floor. The tension in the belt was immense. A breaking belt snapped like a whip. The loose end traveled at over 100 miles per hour. It could take a head off. In 1908, a belt broke in a furniture factory in North Carolina. The loose end whipped across the shop floor and struck 3 men. One lost an eye. One lost an ear. One died instantly when the belt struck his temple. The belt weighed 30 pounds. At 100 miles per hour, it hit with the force of a cannonball. The 3 men were standing 40 feet from the belt when it broke. Factory inspectors tried to create safety regulations. In 1910, Massachusetts passed a law requiring annual belt inspections. The law was unenforceable. There was no standard for what constituted a dangerous belt. A belt could look perfect on the outside and be rotted on the inside. A belt could pass inspection in January and fail catastrophically in July. The inspectors could not predict failure. They could only document it after someone died. New York tried a different approach. In 1912, they passed a law requiring belt guards on all new factory construction. This did nothing for the thousands of existing factories. The old mills kept running with unguarded belts for another 30 years. The workers kept dying. The death toll is difficult to calculate precisely. Factory accident reporting was inconsistent, and many incidents were not recorded. Many deaths were attributed to other causes. A worker pulled into machinery might be listed as dying from crush injuries rather than belt entanglement. A worker who fell into a belt might be listed as falling from a height. The statistics are fragmented. But conservative estimates from labor historians suggest that between 1870 and 1920, leather belt systems killed at least 15,000 workers in American factories. That is 1 death every 30 hours for 50 years. Most were women. Most were under 30 years old. Most had been working in the factory for less than 2 years. Experience did not protect you. Catherine Murphy had 6 years of experience. The belt killed her anyway. The leather belt era ended quietly. Electric motors became cheap enough in the 1920s, and factories began replacing belt systems with individual machine motors. This was not done for safety. It was done because electric motors were more efficient and easier to control. The belts disappeared not because they were dangerous, but because they were obsolete. By 1940, most American factories had converted to electric power. The 5 miles of leather came down. The overhead shafts were removed. The great belt systems were scrapped for salvage. The workers who had spent decades ducking under moving belts and living in fear of loose hair simply moved on to new dangers. The machines were safer, the quotas were higher. The factories found other ways to kill people. But for 50 years, the most dangerous thing in American industry was not fire, not chemicals, not explosions. It was leather, moving at 30 miles per hour, in every factory, above every worker, waiting for one loose thread, one moment of inattention, one strand of hair. The belt did not care. The belt just pulled and it never stopped pulling until someone shut down the engine or there was nothing left to pull.